Thank you for joining us for this informative American Institute of Chemical Engineers webinar sponsored by Provenance Consulting, Embrace Change by Establishing Comprehensive Management of Change Processes. Our speaker is Scott Kindy. Scott Kindy is a process safety management consultant and project manager at Provenance Consulting. He has over 6 years of experience in PSM-related project execution in the oil and gas industry, and he has managed multiple projects related specifically to management of change. He has expertise in project execution related to additional elements of PSM, including process safety information data management, incident investigation, facility siting, process hazard analysis, and compliance auditing. He also has experience with the EPA Risk Management Plant Rule and the associated elements. One quick note before I turn the session over to Scott. As described more fully on this slide, the American Institute of Chemical Engineers assumes no legal liability or responsibility for the use or misuse of the content in this webinar. And now I'd like to welcome Scott Kindy. Hi, Scott.
Hello, Pam, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to join me for this webinar titled Embrace Change Through a Comprehensive Management of Change, or MOC process. As Pam mentioned, I work with Provenance Consulting. I've been a PSM consultant in the oil and gas industry for going on 7 years now. And I've spent much of this time working with various clients to develop and improve their management of change processes. During this time, I've seen many challenges along the way, and that's why we decided to put together this webinar today to talk about some of those challenges and talk about the process as a whole. So I hope it was clear to everyone when you signed up. But a large portion of this webinar is going to be geared towards people that are relatively new to the industry and new to management of change. We'll discuss change management using a variety of examples, including examples in the oil and gas industry, but also examples in real life. That being said, we're also going to discuss the means for assessing and improving your MOC programs, and I think that will be of interest to people of all levels of experience. So with that, we'll get started. The overview of the presentation is provided here. First of all, we'll talk about, most importantly, what is management of change, or MOC. We'll then talk about some challenges associated with MOC programs and processes. We'll talk about why MOC is important. Then we'll look at some ways to establish an effective change management process, maybe for your company, for your facility. We'll look at the components of that process, what all is involved in managing change effectively. And as I mentioned before, we'll also look at some real-world examples in the gas industry, oil and gas industry, but also in our day-to-day lives. We'll then look at how can we assess our MOC program performance. We can do this in a variety of ways. First of all, we need to establish measures to define that success or failure. Then we need to establish some sort of auditing program. That auditing program should be comprehensive to really assess our program. And then finally, we need to report whether we're doing well or whether we're struggling in some cases. And that really drives improvement. Finally, we'll talk about how can we improve change management. So what is MOC? Management of change, or MOC, is an element of the OSHA PSM Process Safety Management Standard. OSHA says that an employer shall establish and implement written procedures to manage changes. It excludes replacement in kind, and we'll talk more about change recognition in coming slides. But it says these procedures will manage changes to process chemicals, technology, equipment, and procedures, and also changes to facilities that can affect the covered process. So this slide gives a breakdown of what OSHA says those procedures should contain. The figure on the right-hand side provides a visual for some of this text that OSHA says, but it also provides some additional steps, and we'll talk about each of those steps in detail later on. But really we wanted to show how an MOC, a comprehensive MOC process, lines up with the OSHA standard. First of all, OSHA says we need a technical basis. The technical basis is the why, the what, the where, the how. It says we need to evaluate the impact of the change on safety and health, or a hazard evaluation. It says we need to consider any modifications to procedures, including operating procedures. We need to define time period for the change. That's often done during the technical basis. We also need to define who's authorized to approve changes. What are the requirements to authorize change? And very importantly, OSHA says that employees that are affected by changes need to be informed of and trained in those changes prior to startup. It also says that process safety information needs to be updated accordingly as it's changed. That goes with a documentation and archive step in the figure to the right. And it finally talks about procedures, which we mentioned with operating procedures, but that could be other procedures as well. OSHA says that all of the information affected by a change needs to be updated. So what are some challenges associated with an MOC program? So we've seen how OSHA defines how we should manage change and the components that OSHA requires in a management of change program. Well, what are some challenges that we've seen? A big one is recognition of change. So I alluded to this earlier. OSHA defines replacement in kind as a replacement which satisfies the design specification. So it can be interpreted as a bit ambiguous. So it's often a struggle, and I've seen this in my experience with various clients, to really communicate to everyone what is a replacement in kind versus what is a change. So that's a constant struggle. One way to identify whether or not you have this struggle is to look at work orders. Maybe you have work orders that define maintenance or any kind of work that you do at your facility. One way to really find out if your facility is recognizing change appropriately is to go through those work orders and see, was this work order, was this work that we did, was it a change as defined by OSHA? And if it was, did we manage it appropriately? Another challenge that we consistently see is consistent procedures. So we often have, and have seen it with many different clients, many procedures that govern different types of changes. So maybe you manage your alarm changes in one fashion, and maybe you manage temporary repairs with another procedure, or temporary buildings with a separate procedure. So what's very important and what is a common struggle is driving consistency within those procedures about how that change is actually managed, and making sure that all of the components included in a effective system are included in those procedures. Another challenge is awareness and priority. Perhaps you've heard this at your facility or on your job site before. This is how we've always done it. That doesn't necessarily, they could be talking about a change, and maybe we're not managing that change appropriately, but oftentimes we hear that said, we've always done it this way, so there's no need to take these extra steps. This has always worked in the past. A lot of times it's hard to drive awareness of what change is and the importance of change management throughout an organization. Accountability is another, this kind of goes with the bullet point in front of this one. Accountability is a constant struggle. Who's ultimately accountable for managing change? Is it the boots on the ground? Is it management? Is it leadership of the facility? It really needs to be all of those. And if that accountability is not clearly stated, then it can be a struggle to effectively manage a change. And finally, training, development, and methodology. So you may develop a great program and have a great program for managing change, but if we don't train the people that are actually on the ground, that are actually doing the changes, then it's still a struggle. We can have the best procedures in the world, but if no one follows them, then they don't do any good. So that training needs to be, we need to have initial training, we need to have refresher training. People forget things change. And we often struggle with employee turnover. So we may have had all of our folks trained at one point, but now we realize the next year we have 40% of the people at our place are now new people. So all of these are challenges that we've seen with MOC programs throughout the industry. So we've seen the challenges, and we talked about what MOC is. Why is MOC important? Well, change is inevitable. I think we all realize this. We see change in our day-to-day lives. We see it constantly throughout our workplace. So if we don't effectively manage change, even minor changes that we think are minor can result in major disruptions from the safety aspect, but also from the business perspective. I've got a couple of very insightful quotes here that I feel apply to change. The first one is from Charles Darwin. He says, "It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that's most adaptable to change." And I think we can all agree with that. Even when we have a lot of smart people working in one place, if they're not managing their changes appropriately, we still see a lot of the challenges that I mentioned before come to fruition in that place. And then the great Billy Crystal says, "Change is such hard work." And I think it's important that we do realize that. And if we don't realize that change is hard work, then we won't put the time and the effort into managing it that we should. So we've got a couple of scenarios here that talk about why MOC is important. First of all, an effective MOC program ensures a comprehensive hazard evaluation. So that was one of the steps that OSHA requires. It's something we've talked about already. It ensures that that evaluation is completed prior to implementing a change. So these two scenarios indicate what happens when that evaluation is not done. So first of all, we'll take a look at scenario 1 on the left. In this scenario, we're installing a bypass. We're bypassing a piece of equipment. Maybe this is a temporary bypass, maybe it's permanent. But in any case, it seems like a relatively simple change. Well, if we don't do a proper hazard evaluation, if we don't include all of the affected people in our evaluation, we may not realize that that piece of equipment has a safeguard on it. It has a pressure relief device. And that safeguard has actually been taken credit for as actually protecting equipment that is downstream of that piece of equipment as well. So if we don't perform a thorough review, we may not realize that, and we may put equipment that's down the line in danger without even realizing it. Now we'll take a look at another scenario, scenario 2 on the upper right-hand portion. In this scenario, another relatively simple change. We had 2 pumps in line. We're just going to remove one of those. We're just going to use 1 pump. So again, relatively simple change. But if we don't do an adequate hazard evaluation, we may not realize that we created a dead leg. If that piece of piping is longer than what it looks like on the drawing, if it's actually a pretty significant piece of pipe, we could create a dead leg by installing a blind flange that could come back to bite us later. And if we don't have inspection involved in the hazard evaluation, we may not get that dead leg on a list to get it removed. And eventually that dead leg could lead to freezing process. It could expand, causing cracking, and eventually it could cause a release. So we talked about why hazard evaluation is important in managing change, but also we talked about, and OSHA mentions, that MOC programs also ensure the completion of documentation updates. So we've got another scenario here. Let's say a vessel has an original MAWP of 226. That vessel at some point gets re-rated, and the inspection system gets updated. If we don't manage our change appropriately, we may realize later on that the release study system did not get updated. And now the vessel is going to be inspected to withstand a pressure that's lower than the relief pressure. So what are the components of an effective change management system? So we talked about why it's important, what it is. We looked at these a little bit when we talked about OSHA, but these components that we have listed here take OSHA's requirements and take it a couple steps further. As we saw before, a design basis or technical basis is very important in a management of change program. This design basis says, what are we doing, why are we doing it, who's doing it. An impact analysis, hazard evaluation, we've seen why that is so important. Approval steps, training, installation is an obvious part of managing change. That is the change itself. A pre-startup safety review, or PSSR, also an OSHA-defined term, is a critical part of management of change. That lets you know, does your construction actually meet your design? Did we install what we said we were going to install? Another approval step. Approval is important throughout the process. It drives accountability. Startup is an obvious step, along with installation. And these last 4 steps are very important too, and this is often not the case. It's often not realized for many folks. Documenting the change is extremely important to know what we did and why we did it, but also assessing how we're doing, auditing, tracking metrics, reporting those metrics, and eventually correcting what we're finding. If we never assess our program, we never realize the things that we're missing until it's too late. It's important to remember many steps in this process lead back to the previous step, and we're going to see this when we go through the examples coming up. But a pre-startup safety review can drive us all the way back to a design basis or impact analysis because of what we find. So it's very important to realize that although this process is linear, it oftentimes goes back to previous steps. And it's very important to remember that once a change is sent back to one of those steps, each subsequent step needs to be completed, sometimes repeated, in succession to maintain the integrity of the process. If we are near the end of the process and something drives us back to the beginning, we can't just skip all the steps between the beginning and the end once we've made the correction. All of those steps are important anytime a change is made. And if we define that a small change to an existing change later in the process, we need to go through each one of these steps again to make sure that the proper analysis is done. So now we're going to look at, in the next few slides, we're going to talk about some real-world examples of effective change management. This will help put things in perspective. We're going to look at it from a couple of fronts. We're going to look at it in our day-to-day lives as well as a refinery setting. So we'll go through each one of these steps. We'll look at some of the loop-back steps that I've talked about, and we'll talk about how we actually do this in our day-to-day lives, whether we realize it or not. And we'll also look at how we should do it as we manage a change in the oil and gas industry. So both of these examples that we will see are examples of a change that need to be managed appropriately to be successful. So all of those steps that we've talked about in detail are lined out here. So as we go through our examples, we're going to step through each one of these steps. First of all is the design basis. The design basis is where we're going to define what we're doing and why we're doing it. In the real world, in our day-to-day lives, maybe that's a kitchen renovation. Maybe the what is replacing flooring, adding new countertops, new appliances. And why are we doing it? It's important. Maybe it's to increase our home value prior to a sale. In the oil and gas industry, the what could be installing a temporary jumper. This is something we saw earlier, to bypass a vessel. The why is also important. The vessel is not adequate for service and must be replaced. The impact analysis for each one of these, this is where we need to analyze the impact of the change. That includes a safety hazard review. What kind of hazards could we be adding that maybe we didn't realize when we did the design? We need to get the right people in the room to discuss this. That means a comprehensive review. We could talk about cost at this point. We could talk about what kind of PPE is required. What kind of materials do we need to perform this change? We may decide during the impact analysis that we need to go back to design. And we're going to see this throughout, this loop back step. Just because we get to the next step doesn't mean we're going to breeze right through it. In many cases, we might decide that there's a reason we need to redesign this. For the real world example, that might be, a wood floor really is too much money. If we use a laminate floor, that would be much less expensive. So cost may drive us to go back to design. Also, in the impact analysis in the refinery setting, we may need to reconsider the metallurgy. We may not have realized when we did the design that this piping system is stainless steel. And we may have designed it with a carbon steel spec. What's very important is that after we redesign, we go back to the impact analysis. So just because we changed what we were told to change doesn't mean we can skip right through to approval. Going back through the step is very important to reanalyze what the new design is. Once we get through the impact analysis, we're going to move to approval. Approval is a very important step up front. This, like we said earlier, drives some accountability. This is where we can define who authorizes the change and who's ultimately accountable for it. This approval step is one way to drive that accountability. So this could be, in your real world example, this could be maybe it's your spouse reviewing what you want to do. They have to approve that cost. They need to approve the risk associated with that. In a refinery, maybe it's a manager associated with a particular unit. In any case, this approval step can drive things back to design. It can drive back to any step we've seen before. In one case, maybe at the approval step, the spouse said, you know what, granite is too expensive as well. We've got some other projects going on, and we can't afford to do that. So let's drive it back to design. Let's switch the materials up. In the refinery setting, we may need to reconsider the location of the tie-in. So a manager may say, I see that you wanted to tie in way upstream of this vessel, but that's going to cause us to have to purchase a whole lot of pipe. There's another great place we could tie in further downstream that will limit that cost. In any case, if we do drive it back to design, we need to reanalyze. So just because a manager or a spouse said this is what we should do, we also need to pull that team together, or pull the documents together. Whatever it was we used to review the design, we need to re-review that design. Approval for construction can also lead back to the impact analysis. So it may not lead back all the way to design. We may decide in the approval step that the analysis that we did before wasn't adequate. In the example of the kitchen, it could be that we noticed that we're going to order new appliances, but nobody measured space for the refrigerator. If we don't do this, we could order the wrong thing. It could cost us time, money. A manager in a refinery might realize that we didn't involve the right people in the change review. Might say we didn't have safety there to review whether or not we're going to cause any occupational safety hazards. If that's the case and we drive it back to the impact analysis, that needs to be re-reviewed and reapproved. Training and notification, you may see this step in a variety of different places. One example and one way that we've seen it in our experience is that training and notification comes before installation. Often we need to let people know this is what we're going to do, this is what's been approved. And maybe that's a certain people need to know. Maybe it's children need to know no more skates in the kitchen, we're changing the type of flooring we're going to have. Maybe operations needs to know that this jumper is about to be installed so they can look at their procedures and update accordingly. Then we have installation. This is a pretty obvious step. Installation is where we install the change. This is where we do the work. This step is also a loop back though, and it's important to remember. Just because we get to this step doesn't mean we just install whatever they gave us. We could decide at this point that the design is flawed a little bit. Maybe there's, in the real world, maybe there's not room for a garbage disposal under the sink like we wanted to install. In a refinery, maybe we need to reevaluate the piping design. Maybe that jumper that we thought was going to fit in this pipe rack actually doesn't fit. Maybe the pipe size is too high. In any case, if we go back to design, all those red arrows there indicate all the steps that we've completed before we have to recomplete. We've got to review the impact of whatever that design changes to. We need to get that approved, and really importantly, we need to notify and train people that this is what's going to actually be installed. Installation can drive back just to the impact analysis. We may decide that in the real world, maybe it's just we didn't understand that this microwave color was really not going to go with these new countertops. So we need to drive back and say, look, we really didn't do a proper review of this. Maybe it's that we need to consider an alternate location for the piping to eliminate some occupational safety hazards. Maybe safety was involved in the review, maybe they weren't, but in either case, we didn't realize that we were creating some trip hazards or some head knockers in all these places because we didn't do a proper review. So we need to drive that back to the analysis stage and evaluate whether or not that's okay. PSSR, or pre-start of safety review, I talked about this before, an OSHA-defined element of OSHA PSM. This is a very important step in the process. This is where we do the walkthrough. This is where we would do cleanup. This is where you decide, did we install what we said we were going to install? This is your one last chance before we start up to make sure that everything actually is safe and that we did what we said we were going to do, but more importantly, what we did was safe and effective. So again, we're seeing a lot of this, but PSSR can drive us back to any step that we've been at before. It could drive us all the way back to design. Maybe in the real world, we decide we need to go back and redesign because the flooring in the dining room needs to match this before we put all this away. In a refinery setting, maybe we realize we didn't install any bleeders on this line. And what happens when we need to drain or clean it? We won't have any way to do so. Either case, those red arrows, again, this is the most important part. Drive us back through each step in that process. And if we don't do that, we may install some bleeders maybe where we shouldn't. If someone on the PSSR team said there just needs to be a bleeder somewhere, but we don't go and do the analysis of its impact on the system, we may not realize we installed it in a bad place. If we don't give someone a chance to approve that, they may not understand that that bleeder got installed, and they may not be driving their operators to go back and look for plugs like they should. If we don't train people that bleeder was installed, or that whatever that change was, then they've been trained on something that actually isn't installed. Because what they saw before wasn't actually what's in the field. So we need to retrain, re-notify. PSSR can drive us back to the impact analysis. Maybe we didn't do enough measuring. We thought we did, but we didn't realize this microwave was going to stick out so much further than the old one did. Now I keep hitting my head on it. Or we realized that we would hit our head on it. This might also tell us during the PSSR that we didn't do a proper review. We didn't even contact environmental. Nobody's prepared for the LDAR impacts of this change for the new components associated with this piping. Again, we see those red arrows driving us back through each one of those steps. If we reevaluate the analysis, we need to make sure that analysis gets approved. And also PSSR can drive us right back to installation. This is often the case that we see. If you've been involved in a PSSR before, there's many times where we said we were going to install something and we didn't install it. Maybe we missed a place in the corner of the room with the laminate flooring. So we need to make sure that before we put everything up or before we let that contractor go or whatever it is, that we get that done. Otherwise, we're going to trip over it later. It's going to be an eyesore. Many things wrong with that. Maybe we didn't install that plug in that bleeder valve we installed. This could be very detrimental in a refinery setting. If we start up without doing that, without installing that plug, we could spill process all over the ground. So the PSSR step can often lead us right back to the installation step and say, let's do what we said we were going to do. Finally, there's startup approval. So again, this is an important step for that accountability reason. We need accountability in our design. We need accountability in our impact analysis. But we also need accountability in the PSSR and installation. And if we're not driving that accountability here, then we often have great design but poor installation or poor walkthroughs. So this step is very important, and again can drive us back throughout the process. Maybe at startup approval we say, no, we really can't live without that garbage disposal. We need to make that work. We're not ending this project until we get that to work. Maybe we decide we called this jumper temporary. Is it really temporary? Maybe that's been kind of talked about throughout the process but never really defined. The startup approval gives us a chance to go back through the entire process and make sure that what we ended up with is in fact what we designed. Startup approval, again, if we go back to design step, we need to go back through each one of these steps. If we go back to the impact analysis step, we need to go back through each subsequent step. Installation is the same way. Maybe startup approval said we didn't install something that that we were supposed to, but maybe there was a good reason for it. We need to re-PSSR that. We need to make sure they installed it correctly. And then finally, startup. This is pretty straightforward. This is when we commence the actual work. The work's done. We say, okay, now we're ready to quote unquote start up. This change is in effect. Document and archive. This can be important in the real world. This means maybe we keep our receipts. Maybe we keep those measurements. Those things can be important later. If we decide to do a future project like this, we want to know what we did right, what we did wrong. We want to make sure we understand what was the cost associated with it. What kind of materials did we end up with? What did we use? What did we like? And then very importantly, and this is often the steps that we're not completing at our site or within our organization, assessment of our process. So there's a time, this is a time for reflection in some cases. In the real world, maybe time's just going to tell you, did we choose the right thing? If things start to break, things start to fail in your house, we really don't like that flooring, maybe we should have done some more research. Maybe we realized that we went to one store, we should have gone to 5 or 6. This assessment is going to tell us that. In the refinery setting, an assessment means this is where you actually audit your process. We go through and we say, okay, let's look back. Let's see what's installed. Let's see what's been installed recently. Did we have a proper design? Did we do a proper impact analysis? Let's go look in the field. Is what's there actually what we designed? And if not, where did we fail? Where did the process break down? This assessment is very important because if you don't do it, in many cases, we just don't know what we don't know. We don't realize that we're failing because we're not assessing it. This assessment phase, we'll go through a couple of examples here, but this can also drive back to the beginning of the process. You may have already started up, and you may have a hazard that you didn't realize you had. In the real world, maybe it's something simple. Maybe we just realized looking back on this, we really can't live without that ice maker. I can't believe we missed that. Let's go back. Let's redesign. Let's get a new refrigerator, whatever that is. Maybe that assessment tells us why are we defining this as a temporary change? We didn't properly identify this time period. It's undefined at this point. Or maybe we're calling it temporary, and maybe the impact analysis was done as a permanent change, or vice versa. And if it's actually a permanent change and we analyzed it as temporary, that could be dangerous in the future. Maybe there's different requirements for installing temporary piping as opposed to permanent piping. So this assessment can tell us a number of things, and it can drive us back to a number of different steps. But most importantly, when it does drive us back, we need to go back through those steps. We need to retrain. We need to reapprove, reinstall in many cases, re-PSSR. So we can see here the assessment can drive us back really to any part within this process. And in my experience, in performing a lot of these assessments, we've seen examples of each one of these. In many cases, we've determined we didn't do a proper PSSR. Maybe the paperwork was signed off, but maybe only one person did it, and your procedure says you need to have 3 or 4 different groups involved. In many cases, we've gone to the field and we've seen, hey, there's supposed to be 3 or 4 bleeders here, and you know what? There's no bleeders installed on this piping. Not only was that an installation failure, it was a PSSR failure. Regardless, it's very important to go back through each step. Reporting, this is where in the real world, reporting maybe isn't as important as what we see in a refinery setting, but maybe reporting in the real world is just letting someone know when they're going to be working on something that you've done it before, and this is what we did wrong. This is how you can do it better. In a refinery setting, that's letting each other know. That means letting management know that this is where our process is breaking down. So after that assessment, if we just assess and don't take any other steps, we're never going to improve. So reporting helps drive the accountability and ultimately helps drive improvement, which is the next step, correcting. In a home improvement project, maybe that's easy. Maybe correcting is just simply ensuring all the measurements. Next time you do this, you're making a procedure for yourself. Make sure that I write down the steps that I forgot to do in the impact analysis. In a refinery setting, correcting is a number of things. One very important thing is focusing training as needed. So correcting means focusing training on the parts of the process that are breaking down, identifying those parts and correcting those. So let's talk about each one of these in detail now, starting with assessment. These last three steps, as I mentioned, are often overlooked in the process. So the next 2 or 3 slides here before the end, that's what we're going to talk about, are the importance of these steps. So the effectiveness of an MOC program can be measured in a few ways. There's more ways than what I have listed here, but these are some very important ways you can do it. So when I say assess, what do we mean? Well, first of all, are changes being reviewed and approved by the appropriate personnel prior to implementation? What does your procedure say? So the first step is, let's review the procedure. Let's see what we do require. If these people are not being involved, are we introducing hazards when making changes that we didn't recognize? So can we go to the field, let's look at some recent changes, and do we see some of those valve stems sticking out at 5 feet off the ground? Or do we see some temporary piping with no kind of pipe supports running across the ground? If we see those things, that's a good indicator that our impact analysis is breaking down. We're not identifying that we're creating these hazards. Also, does construction for new projects match the design? So let's go to the field. Let's take the design drawings and let's look at the actual equipment. In many cases, what we've seen is the design drawings are great. The actual installation is almost great, but it's missing a few things. Maybe it's got a few extra things. Are employees aware of changes that affect them? This is an important one that we often miss. OSHA says we need to notify and train affected employees of changes. Well, one simple way to do this is to go ask. Let's go to our operators. Do they realize that this change just started up in their unit yesterday while they're on shift today? If not, they could go close a valve when they shouldn't, because they're using an old copy of a procedure, or they just didn't realize that this change was in effect. So it's a very important step that's really a very easily identified. Let's just go ask employees if they know what's going on, if they realize these changes happen. Maybe it's just a change to a procedure. Maybe it's a new temporary building in an area that nobody was aware of. And also important, do these training records exist? So we may be saying that we're training our folks. Maybe we talked to a few of them and they seem to understand the process. Are we actually documenting that we're training them on what to do? And then finally, is PSI accurate? This goes back to the PSSR step in many cases. But one quick way to check and see if you're managing change is check your PSI. Do a check on a system and compare that with what's in the field, or compare it with another system perhaps. And if you have deficiencies or discrepancies in your PSI, that often means that you've made changes that you haven't managed appropriately. So that's a good way to assess the effectiveness of your program. What should an audit program look like? So we've looked at ways we can assess, ways we can audit. What should the actual program, the audit program, look like? Well, in my experience, what I've seen is initially it's very important that audit be comprehensive. Maybe you don't want to audit all of your previous MOCs, but you should consider auditing all of your MOCs for a given time frame. Maybe that means you take last month's MOCs and we define what our audit categories look like. We take those questions that I talked about on the last slide, and we go through 100% of our MOCs. Making it comprehensive is important because you may be doing well in some areas or some locations, and you may be doing poorly in others. Or maybe you have 85% of the people that perform MOCs are really good at them and 15% struggle a little bit. So doing a comprehensive audit will make sure that you identify where those gaps are. And gradually, this audit percentage can be decreased over time. As you really start to improve, which we'll see in a minute, as you take the steps to improve your process, that audit process can decrease over time. And depending on the size of your organization, that time frame may be really short. It may take a while. It could be a 2 to 3 year process, maybe longer, to ensure that everyone that's involved in changes understand what the process is. And often turnover, like we talked about earlier, can cause us to need to continually audit because we are bringing new people in. And finally, maintaining consistency and reviewing criteria with MOC owners. So it's very important that stakeholders, that people who are involved in the process, have a dog in the fight, so to speak, that they feel like that they own this process, but also they feel like they have some ownership in defining the process. So it's very important that we go to the people that own our MOCs and we review the audit criteria with them. We let them know what's coming. And we also review this with management. We get everyone on the same page prior to auditing. That way, we're not driving a wedge in between our audit and the people doing the MOCs. And consistency is a very important way to make sure that that wedge stays out of the loop. If we're inconsistent in our assessments, we're going to drive people to misunderstand. So what does reporting look like? So we talked about assessment, reporting, and improving. Reporting looks like, in many cases, let's define what a perfect MOC is, and let's define our deficiencies, and let's show percentages. That's a great way to report how you're doing, especially trending over time. Report a percent perfect versus a percent with deficiencies. This will show you, are we doing, if we did 100 MOCs, did we do 90 of them great, perfect, and 10 bad, or 10 with some sort of deficiency? Well, that's a good sign. If it's flip-flopped, that means we have a lot of work to do. That means we may need to go back to management and get some approvals for some more auditing, or just really go back and look at the process as a whole. And then defining deficiency categories. So this means prioritizing your mitigation. So some elements of the MOC process are more important than others, or maybe some of your audit criteria are less hazardous than others. And so defining that mitigation priority and risk ranking is very important. If you have a whole bunch of documentation errors and 3 significant PSSR errors, you want to make sure you get to those PSSR errors first. They oftentimes pose a higher risk, so we want to make sure that we take care of those first. And also aligning your reporting with your audience is important. So that means you may have levels of reporting. Leadership, they may want to see that purely that percent perfect versus percent imperfect. And they want to drive, over time, they want to see that number going up. That may be the most important thing to them. For management, maybe middle management, maybe they need to understand what group or what area are we struggling in and what kind of struggles are they having, so they can help drive that down. And then personal, the MOC team, we really need that audience, they need to know exactly what they did wrong and how they can do better in the future. So that reporting is really 3 levels. It goes from a very high level to a very detailed level. And then trending, of course, is important to know if you are improving. And if you're not, we need to change our process. So finally, improving change management really takes a top-down approach. And when I say this, that means leadership really needs to be on board up front. If they're not, that accountability that we talked about throughout this presentation is not going to be there. So that top-down approach is very important. Establishing what a good MOC looks like. What does perfect look like? And really setting those expectations, making them clear to everyone involved, extremely important. And let's set our folks up to succeed. If we don't do a review of our procedures, if we don't understand if our procedures are flawed in some way, we're setting people up to fail when they try to follow them. And if we don't train initially, if we don't train at some kind of frequency, we're also setting people up to fail. And let's establish meaningful measures and analyze and audit the data. So establishing the measures means getting stakeholder review and approval, and then analyzing the data and really focusing training as needed. So in conclusion, like Billy Crystal said, change is such hard work, and we've seen how many components it actually has. Managing change is critical to maintaining the integrity of all of our existing equipment, systems, information, and processes. And it can be achieved by these bullet points here: establishing clear expectations through that top-down approach, realizing the importance of those loop-back steps and the resulting re-reviews and approval, establishing auditing and reporting processes that are meaningful, that have meaningful measures, and providing training, refresher training, initial training, and then focusing our training based on those audit results. So I'll just leave you with this challenge. Consider the way change is currently managed at your facility, and audit that 100% of MOCs for a given period of time, and see how you do. I think the results may surprise you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Scott. We'll take questions now, please, in the chat box. You can direct them to host. Here's your first question. In the MOC program, you are showing a linear process, but most of the time the process returns to design bases. Is there a way to have a more flexible process or to introduce some part of the evaluation steps, like a little PPSS, since the definition of the design basis?
Let me make sure I understand the question fully. I think what I heard was it's a very linear process, and we often see these loop backs happen. Is there a way to establish things up front to prevent those loop backs from happening so frequently? I don't know that the process can help you do that. I think over time you will see that by auditing and by training, by focusing training, that's really what's going to help this linear process stay linear. It's by assessing and seeing where your struggles are, focusing training on those people or those areas. And I'm not, sorry, I don't fully understand what a PPSS is, but that may be, maybe we're talking about the same thing. It may be establishing procedures and things like that because of what we've seen over time, and getting those down to the people that are doing the MOCs.
Okay, thank you. In your experience, has the training and notification step always preceded the construction step?
Not always. That's a really good question. It has not. In many cases, the training and notification comes actually after PSSR. But I think it's interesting in some places where I've seen it where they do it up front, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all the training happens at that point. Maybe it's focused training on certain groups or individuals happen pre-installation, and maybe some of that training happens post-installation.
Okay, thank you. Have the audits that you have been a part of been well received by the organization?
Eventually, I would say yes. I think there's any time that an organization decides it's going to audit the people doing the work, I think there's bound to be some pushback. But I think that's why we talked about in some of these slides, getting stakeholder review, having stakeholder approval up front, early on in the process, having that ownership and accountability spread out throughout the organization really helps organization at all levels receive the audits better.
Okay, thank you. Who should do the audit? An independent group not involved in the MOC process or in the actual MOC activity?
That's a really good question as well. I think we've seen it done in a couple of ways. I think there's pros and cons to either way. Having a totally independent group perform the audit allows that group to be just that, to be independent, to not be swayed by maybe relationships or politics or things like that. It allows that audit to be a purely black and white audit, which is very important. But it's also important for whoever's performing the audit to be somewhat integrated into the system, to understand how things work and not purely be an outside observer, because this helps the auditor understand, as well as management and those people that are being reported to, why, and not only the what.
Okay, thank you. We just got a comment in the chat box that maybe you might address as well. Another area of challenge I have seen is temporary MOCs, where once the change is reverted to original, we need to reroute the MOC to the operating personnel.
I'm sorry, Pam, could you say that one more time?
Yeah, it's less of a question than an observation that maybe you might also comment on. Another area of challenge I've seen is temporary MOCs, where once the change is reverted to original, we need to reroute the MOC to the operating personnel.
Yes, that is a great point, and that's a challenge that I've seen everywhere I've been, is that temporary changes, whether it be reverting to original conditions or maybe it's making that change permanent, there's often a disconnect between recognizing that reverting to original or making permanent is also a change, and that change does need to be not only communicated back to everyone, but approved, and the impact analysis needs to occur. We need to do a PSSR in some fashion where we make sure that everything is checked off, especially if we're removing it, that we go and do the walkthrough. So all of those steps, I think that's a great point, are very important when removing temporary changes.
Okay, thank you. Have you witnessed impacts to MOC performance during turnaround shutdown periods?
I would say yes. Often it's just because there's just a lot more MOCs that are being done during this time. And oftentimes the MOCs that are being performed during turnarounds and shutdowns are being performed by maybe capital projects groups or groups that aren't accustomed and individuals that aren't accustomed to being at that particular site and maybe aren't accustomed to that site's particular procedures. So I think, yes, I think going into a turnaround or a shutdown period, it's very important to refocus training, awareness, all of those things with regard to MOC and tracking.
Okay, another comment in the chat box. The MOC metrics audits you mentioned are also very important for tracking efficiency of the process.
Sure, absolutely. I think that is the case. Not only do we want things to be comprehensive and safe and thorough, we also want things to work as they should and work efficiently. So I think those audits, an audit can drive whatever you need it to drive, and by really delving into the system and the processes and looking at the metrics and talking to the people involved, yeah, you can drive efficiency just like you can drive effectiveness.
What about changes in management, personnel, and staffing? I've seen this managed by a separate methodology, a management of organizational change, MOOC. Are there any similarities between MOC and MOOC?
Another really good question. I think yes, definitely, because they're both management of change. So I think you're right. Oftentimes personnel management of change or organizational change is considered separately and maybe even managed separately. A lot of times the Human Resources Department may own those changes more than your process safety or engineering groups, but they should be managed in a similar process. I think all of these steps, they apply. Maybe the questions are a little bit different, but this process is really meant to manage change and not just physical change. That could be organizational change as well.
Okay, thank you. Can you describe some of the organizations and resources to manage a top-notch MOC process?
Sure, absolutely. I think the organizational structure can look differently. What we've seen work really well is having, some technical personnel involved in the audits, whether that be process or mechanical engineering type, chemical engineering type resources. I think those technical people are very apt to recognizing some hazards in the impact analysis, maybe some things that were missed by, maybe it's a new person, and they can, having that technical background helps you really kind of go through the checklist that someone else went through and have some experience to know if they missed something. Also, you know, just experience is important. Having someone perform the audits that has seen how change should be managed is very important. I think a lot of things that you recognize over time that maybe you wouldn't have caught that when you first started. So I think having some just experience in the industry, maybe some technical expertise are great things to have on the audit. A lot of times this is accomplished by having an audit team, not just an audit individual. And maybe that team is 2 people, maybe it's more. The more people you get, the harder it is to drive consistency. But you can help manage that by having an audit team.
Okay, let's see if we can get another question. And in your experience, which is a good benchmark of compliance with MOC process?
A good benchmark of compliance. I would say, you know, as you develop your auditing processes, like we mentioned in some of those slides, I think there's specific questions that you should ask yourself. And a benchmark would be, are we consistently managing change such that people understand the change happened? We are installing what we said we were going to install. We are doing proper impact analysis, and we're doing them within a 90 to 100% effectiveness, I think is a good benchmark.
Okay, thanks for that answer. I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have for questions today. So if your question was not answered, please send it to producer@aiche.org. So now on behalf of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers and everyone who attended today, I'd like to thank Scott Kindy for this very informative presentation. Thanks also to our participants for your cooperation and thoughtful questions. Please visit aiche.org to replay this webinar or to view and sign up for our many others. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in a webinar soon.